From this very first trailer to the release date commercial, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time has had a very deep development history, going through different stages and changes on a grand level to the point where the game looked like a completely different game, especially the locations. So today on Cut Content, we look at the cut and altered locations of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Now, before we begin, it is very important to understand that Zelda 64 went through various stages of development, which became clear through the HUD at the top of the screen that shows Link's equipment. These include Stage 1 of development, known as A plus B only, Stage 2, the A plus C buttons only, Stage 3, A plus B plus C, but in an older style, and Stage 4, A plus B plus C, but in the modern style. All these represent the 4 stages of development, which I'll be referencing throughout the video. With that out of the way, let's start with the ever popular but rather large cut town that may or may not have been a very early version of Hyrule Castle Town or Kakariko Village. And we know this is very early too, as this is stage 1 of development with only the A and B buttons. The town has many houses and likely points to it being more an early version of Castletown, as it has a large wall protecting the town, and this spire here, which while it is hard to indicate what it is, may have been either the roof of Hyrule Castle or the Temple of Time. The town also, while empty, with it being this early in development, has one NPC known as Arya. Interestingly, only short an S to make Saria, so she might have actually been a beta Saria, and therefore this could have been an original starting town. Or just a complete coincidence. Regardless, this is a very expansive town, the likes of which likely didn't appear in the final game since it would go easily beyond what the N64 could do, and more of what the GameCube would be able to do. Therefore, we instead got a heavily pre-rendered one in the final game. Next, we have what is actually found within the Giga leaks, a leaked untextured castle. This was originally seen in an old beta screenshot in a textured form. As one can see, it is a very large area, but it seems the walls were all you were meant to see, as hovering over the walls shows that there is no floor here. This likely was meant to have a separate indoor map that would load once inside, but nothing of that was leaked to know for sure. Considering the large spire here and it being a rather fortified traditional castle, I have a theory that this might be the very castle from the beta version of Castletown that we saw. So yes, this may in fact be the beta Hyrule Castle. Now another theory as to what the spire in Castletown might have been is the Temple of Time, due to its pointed roof. During development, there were 3 different versions of the temple made. A smaller one that had warmer lighting and a narrower path. The screenshot here has an altar, which I imagine is where you would have drawn the Master Sword. This was from the second stage of development. But thankfully, the Giga leaks gave us another version of the temple, which looks a lot like the one just shown, except without the warm lighting, and it's all pre-rendered rather than being full 3D. I imagine this was from the 3rd stage of development, as the 4th stage of development was the Temple of Time we are familiar with. Big, wide, and bright. There are some big differences still, such as the light medallion warp pad being here. Otherwise, the only other difference is that it has a Hyrulean upside down Triforce on top of the Door of Time. Now, if we go outside, you normally can only see the main outdoor pre-render of the temple and nothing else. The Giga leak, again, gave us more, and we got to see more pre-renders of the surrounding area that shows the stairs leading up to it, meaning we might have had a more seamless transition from Castletown to the temple. Now, leaving the Hyrule Castletown area, here we are at what appears to be a beta version of Lon Lon Ranch, except it is very massive. Likely it's meant to imitate a real farm or ranch, with it being this early at stage 2 of development. While stage 2 only shows off cuckoos and a massive area, this old design of Lon Lon Ranch appears to have survived all the way to stage 4 at least, as seen here in the screenshot of Link in what appears to be a similar area riding Epona. The big head scratcher is where it was located at stage 4, as it already had a Hyrule field in place, and this already looked as big as Hyrule field on its own. I theorized that at this point, Lon Lon Ranch might have been in its own separate area off to the side of the field. Now moving on, here's a beta form of Lake Hylia, which appears to have been more of a port with no real island or features on the waterfront itself. A house was still present with an unused female NPC as well. Also, a little dock was here too, which would have been perfect for the fishing minigame. From the looks of it, the design of Lake Hylia survived all the way from Stage 1 to Stage 3 of development before being completely redesigned to the final version we have today. Now, while we haven't seen a Kakariko village in this, a beta graveyard exists, which may have been linked to the beta castle town that we saw earlier. And it looks amazing in my opinion, with its blood red appearance. It adds so much more to its haunting appearance too. Like the final version, it includes a Poe, even though it is an early Poe from the second stage of development. Now notice how in all these beta screenshots, Link is an adult and no child Link is in sight? Well, up till this third stage of development, the time travel mechanic had not been a part of the story, but yet what we have here is a beta version of the Great Deku Tree in what is Stage 2 of development meeting Adult Link. At that point of development, there doesn't seem to be any evidence of a Kokiri forest, and it is understood that Link may have likely started out in Castletown. So in this instance, it is possible that Link went on a quest to meet the Great Deku Tree. How he got there? Well, maybe it was through the Lost Woods. The Lost Woods are a running joke at this point in the Zelda Cut content community, as they have existed in an expansive form in both Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess, but were cut prior to the game's release. Here, it is an expansive forest, likely may have been beyond what the N64 could have handled and was cut. It was also covered in a thick fog too, which may have been to assist in obscuring the culling that would take place in loading further areas, but also to resemble the Link to the Past Lost Woods. We have a beta Poe here, which in the traditional sense, Link would have finished off using a bow. Notice how in this stage of development, the buttons merge when Link uses a bow? Each button may have represented one of Link's arms. But later by Stage 4 of development, we got the Kokiri Forest in the game once Child Link was implemented, where we even have one screenshot of him. But we also have, through the Giga leaks, the beta version of the Kokiri Forest from the screenshot. This appears to be a lot simpler in design to the final version and more open-ended. It may have even been unfinished as there are only a few houses here, but it does have a much more fluid approach to the Great Deku Tree here as it slowly gets less obscure when you get closer. This being a much nicer sight as it felt like it gave the forest more life rather than it being a thin haul you take to him. Up till now, you may be asking, were there any dungeons cut or altered? And yes, there were, at least 5 of them. The first dungeon we'll be looking over is a beta dungeon that was leaked in the famous Giga Leak 2. Stitched and made playable thanks to the efforts of Dr. Disco, we have this dungeon in a fully playable state. This dungeon was originally known to exist throughout various screenshots and footage during the Zelda 64 development, and we'll be comparing the dungeon to those very shots. The dungeon starts off in a room with 2 doors, in a non-linear fashion. This mod also has Link looking more like his beta build too. Going to either of these hallways leads you to a hall with a fire keys roaming around. The one big point of interest here is this eerie statue with its tongue sticking out. As this is baked into the map, it likely was just meant for design purposes. However, entering the next door in either of these hallways leads you to the same next room, showing the path you pick wouldn't have mattered in the end, which is an odd choice considering any path in Zelda usually will have an extra purpose for itself. This shows how experimental this design was at this stage. This room is where we hit our first enemy, this beta Stalfos. Normally this room wouldn't even have any enemies loaded, but because we have this old screenshot that shows that there was a Stalfos in here, he was loaded into this map too. The beta enemies from the leak didn't come with any of their own code unfortunately, so they have been mapped to their final game counterparts. So the beta Stalfos fights as he would in his final incarnation, as opposed to his brain dead design as seen in the old footage of this game. By looking further into this room, the biggest point of interest is this stone slab, which clearly has the L is real text from Super Mario 64 on it. Considering Zelda 64 was using a modified Mario 64 engine, textures like this appearing aren't a surprise. While you can't interact with it now, it's hard to say what it would have said. Aside from that, the only way forward is this next door. What we get to is what may define what this dungeon actually is. We have stairs going up to these torches along this hallway. This is seen also in an old screenshot, and even the final game. Yes, Ganon's tower has this exact hallway, but more polished. We'll get more on that fact later. Taking us now into this room, we have one beta golden iron knuckle. The iron knuckle is seen originally in this screenshot of the game, and the model was originally found with 2 shields, but was repaired to have a sword too for this segment. The room has an interesting varied design. There is this indented square in the middle, which makes me think there might have been a treasure chest here once you defeated the iron knuckle. And as well, there is this balcony area here. To get to the balcony area, you just need to take a right through another set of stairs, and nothing is here. But I also imagine a treasure chest might have appeared here too. But taking the left on that room, we are now at an outdoor stairway with what appears to be a beta floor master. Floor masters don't actually appear in any beta screenshots in this dungeon, but we do have them in another beta dungeon from what we can see here. But then we get to what is probably the strangest room in this dungeon, with a glow-up area. The 3 enemies put here are just modified iron knuckles with a moblin's movement and AI. This is actually not from any beta concept. The glow-up area is a big head scratcher, however. It's too big for a treasure chest, and at most I think this might have just teleported you to another area. But then we get to the final area, which is one more outdoor stairway before leading up to the very top of the tower. So the question is, what was this dungeon even? And if the hint to those hallways looking a lot like the ones from Ganon's tower wasn't clear enough, myself and many others theorize this could have been the beta form of Ganon's tower. It contains everything from those halls, simple squarish rooms where you face off against enemies including Iron Knuckles and Stalfos, and this top area might have been where you would have faced off against Ganon in a climatic battle. But aside from the Giga leak, we had a leak of a debug ROM of Ocarina of Time many years ago. The ROM came with a few extra cut rooms in its data that clearly points to the existence of other dungeons that were cut. The first is this room with light pouring in from the window. The light effect in fact looks a lot like the one from Big Boo's haunt from Super Mario 64. We see in a beta screenshot Stalfos also being in this room, which with a patch we can somewhat recreate this part. But this is only one room, as we do have another screenshot from that era showing off more of that dungeon, and we know it's the same dungeon due to the floor patterns looking exactly the same too. But alas, we have another room within the debug ROM that appears to be a boss room. We know it's a boss battle room too, with how it has a teleporter that transports you out like a normal boss battle would too. The beta screenshot of this room also shows a boss battle against a bigger Stalfo. If this dungeon is one based heavily around Stalfos, it's possible that this was in fact the boss room to that previous room I showed. Otherwise, the floor textures, while it is squared, doesn't have that colored pattern, but it might just be different because it's a boss room. Next, we have this bluish looking dungeon. We don't have it in a playable form, and at first glance, due to more Stalfos being there, it might look like it is more of that last dungeon. However, we know it's separate from the other dungeon because of its blue design that's rather prevalent. Some theorize that this might actually be a remake of the first dungeon of Zelda 1 even, because of its blue appearance and overload of Stalfo that appeared in the original dungeon. But the biggest eye-catcher of this dungeon is that you can actually get the full Triforce in this dungeon, much as how in the original Zelda 1 dungeon led you to one piece of the Triforce. Hard to say why the Triforce was there in the first place, but it is possible that this dungeon was just made as a test, especially if this was the Zelda 1 remake of the first dungeon, and the Triforce being there was just possibly an end goal to test all this. However, going back to the debug ROM, there is one more room of interest I want to show, and it's this very unique looking room. The textures are nothing like in the game, and kind of reminds me of the boss room of Majora's Mask's battle. If this was a boss room, nothing points to what it could have been for. Some think it could have been the beta room for Ganondorf, to the point where the whole Ganondorf boss battle was even modded into this room, and surprisingly fits in nicely too. Now, when we data mine the released game itself, There are a few pieces of unused text. One refers to a wind medallion. At first, one might think this is just a cut temple, but it is very likely the forest temple. One reason is due to how the forest temple area in Ganon's castle was entirely wind-based instead of a bow and hookshot puzzle like the one we have today. Therefore, it is possible that they changed the forest temple to not have its wind puzzles in the end and just use those wind puzzles for Ganon's castle and part of the Shadow Temple. The other is that the forest medallion has a clear windmill symbol on it, which, unlike the medallions like the Fire Temple, having a clear flame symbol on it, this doesn't fit with the Forest Temple. That could have simply instead used a leaf symbol. The other data mined medallion, however, is an ice medallion. I'm sure many of you already theorized that the Ice Cavern might have been a cut dungeon on its own, but this does solidify what it was at one point. We already do have, through data mining, some beta elements of this dungeon too. Most famously, we have this odd red ice block, which appears in place of the metal boots. As well, we have an unfinished version of the dungeon too, that fails to load certain points. All of this points to how this dungeon was revised to be the cut down version that we have today. In fact, much like the Forest Medallion, the Water Medallion also has an ice symbol on it, rather than any water symbol, which may indicate that they decided to replace the Ice Temple with the Water Temple as the Temple of the Zoras in the end. Okay, now that we got that out of the way, a beta version of Dodongo's Cavern that was similar to the final game's version. However, we still had some decent changes too, as this was a dungeon that existed all the way back in Stage 1. The biggest difference I would say is that King Dodongo looked a lot more like the smaller versions, except Big here. The big headpiece in the dungeon also looked very different as well, looking a lot less threatening. But going outside of the dungeon, we have the beta version of Death Mountain, which looks to have been this enclosed area, not seen in the final version of the game. This was all the way from the first and second stage of development. Now, while this footage of Link jumping into it is from the second stage, notice that little caved in area with the pillars? I do think that this screenshot here might have been from Stage 1's version, due to the similarities in appearance, except there were Octoroks here and grass. Likely removed cause it didn't fit Death Mountain and it ended up getting Tektites in place. But furthermore, we also have what might be the entrance to Dodongo's Cavern, but it looked more like a traditional dungeon entrance rather than a giant hole in the wall that we have here. Either that or this was just an entrance to what could have been Goron City, but I doubt that existed this early in development. Now we're in the desert. Traditionally, it looked pretty obscured with a sandstorm. In the beta, no sandstorm was there. We can also see levers here in a second stage screenshot, which still looked very similar to their final design. Otherwise, we didn't see any more images of it until the third stage of development, when we started to see varied landscapes featuring various plants not seen in the final game. Hyrule Field, as I understand, likely was time to start stitching all these areas they had made at this point, which while much of Hyrule Field looked the same as the final game, as this was getting closer to the end of development, there is evidence that wild horses did roam around the field too, which would have been convenient to hop onto early in the game to traverse before getting Epona, that being a feature planned prior to Breath of the Wild implementing it again. In fact, we got this fence that a horse can hop over by the Hyrule gates, which isn't in the final game. I wouldn't be surprised if the horses were axed once Child Link was implemented, as he wouldn't be able to ride a horse. Now we are hitting up the Great Fairy Fountain to look at the beta version of the Great Fairy, which looked more fairy-like and was blue. Nowhere near as horrifying as the final versions. Surprisingly, this was there up till the fourth stage of development before it was cut for what we got in the end. Some do think, however, that this might have been a unique fairy from the traditional ones that we see in the final game, and maybe it gave Link a certain ability, namely a Blade Beam. Now here is what is the holy grail of the Zelda cut content community that everyone is looking for: Unicorn Fountain. This fountain appeared in the fourth stage of development, was a unique fountain separate from the fairy fountains that also appeared in the same stage of development. The fountain is very mysterious, with there being these 3 unicorn statues in it, all in different poses. 3 is always the magic number since Link to the Past, as it represents the Triforce, and that alone spawned many rumors to maybe these statues would give you the Triforce. It didn't help that the original Nintendo website that showed off these screenshots pointed to how they had Triforce symbols plastered right on them to fuel further rumors. However, I doubt this was going to be the case, as you are able to enter this as Child Link as seen here, and he likely wouldn't have been the one getting the Triforce. It'd be probably more Adult Link if anything. But what would the purpose have been then? Maybe it was to give a very important item or move to Link. Maybe it opened a major path to a new area. Very hard to say, but with it being unique like this, it's very possible that it was something massive. But unless we get this leaked one day with its related scripts, or the developers just outright tell us like they did with the R-Wing, we might never know. Recently, a development cartridge of F-Zero X was discovered, and upon inspection, this cart was at one point a copy of the 1997 build of Ocarina of Time. But even though it was overwritten, a ton of content from the 97 build was still there, including a whole horde of maps. Starting off, last time we looked at a big exterior we found of Hyrule Castletown with its massive walls and Hyrule Castle right smack in the center. This time, we actually now have it here with an entire beta Hyrule field from stage 1 or 2. These walls and gates are literally the exact ones now textured and in place of where Hyrule Castle's final gates normally were together too, with that castle that we saw resting on a hill. In fact, if one goes to its side, we even find what appears to be a grave plaque on its side. Maybe a hidden entrance? Cause otherwise that's an odd place to bury someone. As for the rest of Hyrule Field, it both appears familiar and very different. It has some more inclines and slopes all over the place, offering a lot more of a varied land compared to the final games. In fact, its size as such does seem larger, and no horses being planned yet at this stage made this a very long walk to get around. As well, this build has no Lon Ranch at the center, but instead it does have a farm to the south near the forest where we saw in the screenshots that contain cuckoos. All that time, many of us thought that this was a very large Lon Ranch, but instead it was just the rest of Hyrule Field we saw in the distance. And the amazing thing is that all the normal exits of Hyrule Field are still in their rightful place, from the forest, Zora River, Kakariko Village, Lake Hylia, and the Gerudo Valley, showing how early they had all these locations planned. In fact, there is a very nice complicated river system coming out of Lake Hylia that you can hop between, and if you zoom the camera out far enough, you can see it flows all the way to the Zora River, making one interconnected Hyrule. Now that's some serious depth I wish they had kept. However, this being from stage 1 and 2, and this being a stage 4 build, it does have a stage 3 and stage 4 build of Hyrule Field 2, which looks a lot more like the version we are used to. Inclines and slopes being a lot closer to our version and not as steep as the older versions. One of the major differences is that there are a ton of horse fences you can jump over with a horse, as stages 3 and 4 had wild horses roaming all around and you could catch one and ride, done 18 years prior to Breath of the Wild, and these fences being there to encourage wandering around with a horse. There are also a lot of fences that surround the usual exits of the field, and from what I can see, it's done because those areas are not complete, as I don't see a way to get into Kakariko Village here, or here to Lake Hylia for example. Speaking of Lake Hylia, it's really disappointing not to see a river flow out of it and creating a complicated river system like in stage 2. But with that, we move to Lake Hylia, and it's a very different Lake Hylia. It's literally the one we saw from the screenshots. Same house is still here, and even that little dock is here that we saw Link running along with a horse. However, we can tell that this is from stage 3 since the path in this older screenshot of stage 1 had a little island in the water that isn't here anymore. However, the walk up to the lake and the house is very long and very wide, something that definitely might have been too much for the N64 to handle. As stated last time, the lake itself is very simple with no details in the lake itself. However, when pulling into a level editor, we can see that this has an exit right at the dock, and apparently something is at the other end of the dock. Some have theorized that maybe Jabu was originally here at the dock, and Link was to walk into his mouth that way. But hard to say, as it won't read what it was actually here in the editor, as this is an old map. In fact, being so old, its textures are still from Stage 1 and 2 despite it being updated for Stage 3 map. The other thing is that there is this one path here by the side of the mountain that takes you somewhere. Hard to say where, but maybe it was to the fishing pond. The fishing pond is in a very unfinished state, as there is no entry booth, no exits, and going into the water, it doesn't even have a hole for Link to swim out of. It does, however, use the textures from Stage 3 and 4, showing this is still newer than the Lake Hylia map that I just showed. But moving south, we got another beta version of the Kokiri Forest. While looking similar to the final games, there are some major differences, such as no entry to the Lost Woods or the hole where you get the Kokiri sword. In fact, there is a giant fence blocking half the forest from being accessed. Though looking at a level editor, it's clear that this was done for the same reason it was done in Hyrule Field, as the other side isn't actually complete. There are no exits actually on any of the houses that are beyond it, and not even an exit to leave the Kokiri Forest. Odd part is that this one is newer compared to the other beta version that I showed, which is of the same stage of development actually, as both had young Link in the screenshot. My theory being that the older version might actually be from Stage 3 all along and stayed temporarily for Stage 4 before they changed it to this newer one. I mean, considering the older one's massive size and seamless transition to the Deku tree, I can believe that. But then, of course, we come to one of the best finds, which is the completely different inside the Deku tree dungeon. Compared to the released version, it's a very complicated dungeon. It has a large column in the middle that you climb to get to the very top, which the inspiration may or may not have come from Bob-omb Battlefield as a starter level, but it has many rooms inside the column and a lot of rooms you go to the side to get to the other sections of the center column. One of these rooms is actually seen in this very famous screenshot where you see these windows shining a beautiful light here. And these rooms all have their own little puzzles you solve before you can progress. At the top, all that seems to exist is a treasure chest, which I theorize may contain a key that led to a door at the bottom that leads underground. A surprise, as keys didn't exist this early in the final game. But on the path to go underground, it leads to the only map that stayed the same, which is the boss room of Goma. But while that might have been a Stage 3 or 4 dungeon, there is actually a Stage 1 or 2 version of it too, complete with older textures of a wood finish, much simpler and very unfinished. You can still go up a spiral, but no side rooms exist whatsoever. It still has the boss room for Goma 2 that looks similar, but the door frame is different, has a blue roof, and the textures are of a lower quality. Seems they really wanted to kill this poor tree from the very start of development. But continuing in this forest, we have an area that looks like it's straight out of Stage 1 or 2 and has a very hard time loading all of it, as it might be too much for the N64 to handle, but it's surrounded entirely by trees and has a pathway that goes straight to this temple-like structure. The structure, interestingly, has an entrance in its data despite it not having a door texture, and with its white exterior and forest setting, I'm theorizing the entrance led to a beta version of the Forest Temple, and that this area was also the beta Sacred Forest Meadow. So in this case, what does the Forest Temple look like in this stage? Well, the Forest Temple, which appears to be Stage 3 or 4, happens to be a lot like the final games version still, with many areas still looking similar. While there are minor differences here and there, such as this massive light blooming down into the main room unlike the released versions, the major differences lie with everything that leads to Phantom Ganon. Instead of taking an elevator down, it's a set of stairs. The Poe sisters still seem to be here, including the torches that need to be lit to open the path. Once you go downstairs, you will see that the rotating mechanic that's there in the final version isn't here, and so you can go straight to Phantom Ganon, which Phantom Ganon's room, however, is a lot different, as it has a very small platform to fight on, which would make for a tougher fight. But one of the other major differences exists in this room with broken pillars that never appeared in the game. What these were for, I'm not sure, but I do love the details around it. But now as we leave the forest, there is one more major area that needs to be looked at, and it's the Beta Lost Woods. Yes, that Beta Lost Woods from the screenshots with the crazy amount of trees. From first glance at the map, It's just a large area with a lot of flatlands and some obstacles. But if we open this up in a level editor, we can see that it has a crazy amount of unloaded objects here, and almost all of them are very likely meant to be trees. So yes, this is a stage 3 or 4 version of the Beta Lost Woods. This also has 5 exits here too, likely leading to other sections of the Lost Woods, the Sacred Forest Meadow, the Kokiri Forest, and Hyrule Field. I can tell from just looking at this of why they had to remove this, as the N64 wouldn't be able to run this many trees at once in such a large area. In fact, running around in a clean version of the map has a hard enough time rendering all of it. We were indeed that close to getting the Beta Lost Woods, but limitations may have prevented us. But before we hit up another familiar settlement, let's look at this isolated archery range from Stage 3. Originally, many thought that this was a part of a larger Lon ranch since it had a similar fence to the one we saw in the beta, but it appears to be a completely separate map of its own with a ton of targets you could shoot while on horseback. What's strange is that this area is entirely fenced off and has no entrance. Possible that this was never meant to be a part of any existing map and you were just zapped here to play a minigame. Here we are now in a very early version of Kakariko Village from Stage 1 and 2, which we know because of its textures. It's very simple with only a handful of copy and pasted houses. It appears to also have its usual exits, with one leading to a graveyard through these brick walls, and another leading to Death Mountain through what appears to be a tunnel instead of the usual open pathway. We'll tackle the graveyard first, and it's clearly from the same stage as the early Kakariko Village, considering the brick walls and the textures. But the biggest note is that this is the same graveyard where Link fights a Poe from that Stage 2 screenshot. The graves themselves are interesting too, as they have a literal cross on them, likely something that would have been censored by Nintendo at the time. In fact, remember that grave we found in the Stage 1 and 2 version of Hyrule Field? It matches perfectly here. Now remember the tunnel entrance I showed at Kakariko Village to get to Death Mountain? Well, we have a map of a tunnel from Stage 1 and 2 to potentially match that entrance. Very straightforward and both ends clearly lead to outside, so it might open up to Death Mountain's exterior, which might even be this door we saw in this old Stage 1 screenshot of Death Mountain. I did show the Stage 1 version of Death Mountain, but here we instead have it in its Stage 3 and 4 incarnation, which looks a lot like the version we have with some differences. The entrance to Goron City isn't built yet, but the entrance is still active. Now, while this is a Stage 3 or 4 map, what I find interesting is that when you look down at Kakariko Village from here, you see the Stage 2 version we explored earlier on display in the distance with all its simple houses in the same places. I imagine they wanted to keep that same basic layout at this point before they did the massive overhaul later. Aside from that, much of Death Mountain is still similar, with only a fairy fountain entrance missing. But in addition, a cave does exist in the data that has textures matching what we saw of Beta Death Mountain from Stage 1 and 2 in those old screenshots. It's a very simple cave that appears to contain water and a pathway to somewhere else. But moving to Dodongo's Cavern, it has been in the game's development since the very start, and what we see here is a Stage 3 or 4 version of that map, with its modern head in place, but a very different layout in the main area. It has a connected pathway in the middle and multiple platforms in front of the big head that were never there in the final release. Aside from that though, a lot of the rooms do look similar, but some still have some major variations, like this blue room having an extra pathway that leads to this hallway here, or this room with a giant slide that leads you down a chute if you're not careful, but also the pathway to the boss room that is just past the big head is actually going straight to the boss room this time, instead of just being more rooms prior to it. So now let's go inside of the Death Mountain crater, which is similar but different from the Death Mountain crater we got in the final version. Here, the one difference I can see is that it has a pathway winding down instead, but otherwise a lot of it is still very similar. The more interesting part is this large maze-like tunnel system, which based on it having volcanic activity at the bottom, does indicate that this might also be a part of the Death Mountain crater too. Maybe one of the exits at Death Mountain crater led to this, but it does seem to have both an entrance and an exit, so maybe one end of it led to Goron City even. The maze has arrows that guide you through to the exit. However, if one explores, there appears to be a treasure chest there too for your hard effort. But of course, how else does one complete the crater without seeing the Fire Temple? The Fire Temple, like the Forest Temple, is once again somewhat similar, but has some major differences in certain areas. First off, there is no Goron cells anywhere, so no rescuing yet. And unlike the final game's room to the right, which is a complicated looking room, this version is very basic and looks almost like you can't get across. But opening it up in a level editor, we do see something exist directly above that might lower if Link does something, I imagine. Maybe it's a long bridge? And instead of going above by going to another room, it seems that one would have to climb this massive structure and use maybe an elevator to get to the next area. Another major difference is this maze area, which normally is one big circular structure split in half, with one half of it being a maze and the other being lava. At this stage, the whole thing was a maze. While there are other minor differences, like the boss room having 2 platforms to hop on instead of 1, these are the biggest differences. Now some of you may be wondering if the beta giant Hyrule Market Town is here, and unfortunately it isn't, despite having its exterior here. However, we do have 2 beta versions of it from stage 3 and 4, each looking very similar to each other with minor differences, and one is probably from stage 3 and the other being from stage 4. We unfortunately don't have pre-renders that go with these, but compared to the final game's polygonal map, it has the same basic structure as the Adult Link version of this map. We do also have an earlier version of the entrance to Market Town, which looks similar except it has this one lamppost here. And now we have this odd map here too, which also lacks a pre-render, but based on the fountain we're seeing here, this might be another angle of the market. But the oddity is that this pipe is coming out of the fountain, which makes me really wonder what this map truly might belong to. And now we have the beta version of the Temple of Time from stage 3 and 4. We have seen it in screenshots prior and mentioned where it has a different warp pad, a green door of time, and of course an upside down Laurulian Triforce. Sometimes makes me think that beta Zelda 64 just simply exists in Lorule, where it keeps all this cool stuff. But now let's go to the outside of the Temple of Time. And we have a render of it that looks familiar but different, with the stairs going in a different direction. It, however, didn't come with a pre-render. But remember that old pre-render from the Giga leak that showed off those bigger surroundings of the Temple of Time? Well, if you lay this right over this, it perfectly fits. So now we have a complete map. But while in the area, let's look at the beta version of Hyrule Castle. It's a lot more simple, as the roads only have one path to the castle and no vines anywhere. Likely means that the stealth part wasn't in yet. Also, a path exists that splits off to a bombable wall, which is in the final version, but in a different part of it. Which, for those who forgot, contains a Great Fairy. Also, the castle does have somewhat of a different appearance too, with smaller roofs, no center tower, and insignia on the front. Now going back to the adventure, we have a really old beta version of the Zora River from stage 1 and 2 based on the textures. It's very simple compared to the final versions, as it's one simple path where you climb this ramp to get to the very top. Sadly, we have no Zora domain, but we do have a beta version of the Water Temple, and compared to the Forest and Fire Temple, this is a completely different dungeon. The first thing one will notice is how massive it is. Instead of being 3 levels of water, it has 4. And because it has 4 levels, it has even more interconnected rooms all over the place. And even someone like me, who is good at mapping Metroidvania-like maps in his head, got lost here. It even has a platforming section! However, the other thing is that this has a very prevalent Japanese theme to it. Everything from the center tower to the rooms decorated with Japanese aesthetic, and this big round bridge leading to the boss room. I mean, the boss room's wall all look like decorated sliding doors of a Japanese mansion even. While in the boss room, it's completely different, with no spikes on the wall, a very deep water, and 4 platforms that appear to be where you can hookshot and move around. Would Morpha even be the boss in this case? And I do understand why this version may have been scrapped, as it was a little too complicated. We struggled with 3 levels of water. 4 would have been a killer, and a much larger dungeon would have made it much more confusing. I do wish this was, however, still given to us on the Master Quest version of the game as a harder version of the temple. While we don't have access to beta Jabus insides, we do have this one room that looks to be a test room for how his flesh works, and probably is a test room considering it's square and has no exits. Queuing to this lovely theme, we are now in the Gerudo Valley. The first thing we do see is a number of tents here. The final game only has 1 tent, however, for the carpenters. Now the major difference comes at the very end of the valley. On the right, you have the usual entrance to the Gerudo Fortress. But on the left, you have a direct route to the desert, which normally requires you to go through the Gerudo Fortress to get there. While I know the desert here that we see is likely meant to be a background for the transition considering the large cacti, it is still a very large desert to walk through. But while we don't have a beta Gerudo Fortress here, we do have the Gerudo Training Grounds in its beta form, and this was a completely different dungeon. Unlike the final games, where it has 3 different paths that all intersect in the middle and you get the ice arrows, this has 3 completely separate and linear paths. The left and right paths are very short, and the center one being a rather lengthy, varied, but familiar one. According to Level Editor, all of them have torches at the end that you were supposed to light. While it's unknown what the purpose of this was, maybe the Gerudo would have awarded you with something for lighting all 3. Hard to say. Also, the middle one, interestingly enough, is actually very similar to the area you race Dompe's ghost underground. I guess when this dungeon got redesigned, they decided to repurpose this lengthier section. Now there are a number of pre-render rooms too, but they don't actually have the pre-renders that belong to them. So going quickly over them, we have these 2 Kokiri houses that don't match any of the ones that exist in the game. We also have the beta version of Link's house. And we have a beta shop, which is more complex with it actually having a rendered table here. Oh, and we do actually have a matching pre-render to go with it. Next, we have the beta version of the Chamber of Sages, which looks similar, but all the medallions and Triforce are just flat textures rather than the solid polygon that they were in the final version. Also note that the Shadow and Spirit medallion being black and gray in this version. Finally, we have a beta version of the Fairy Fountain. And since the textures of this entrance is similar to the final games, it is from probably stage 3 and 4. There's a fountain right smack in the middle where the Great Fairy would have risen from. But the question I know some of you have is, did we find Unicorn Fountain? And sadly, the answer is still no, with an asterisk. So hear me out here. The fountain in many ways already looks like the fountain we've seen in Unicorn Fountain screenshots. Now say if they lowered the middle fountain, add in those 3 unicorn statues right around it, and even have them clipped through the fountain, you'd probably then have the actual Unicorn Fountain that way. So while this may not have been the actual one we were looking for, this is the closest we've gotten so far, much as we have with the beta Hyrule Market Town. Having been in the Zelda Cut content community for a very long time, I've seen small discoveries made here and there. From inside the very cartridge of the game, to a leaked debug ROM that gave us some maps, the Giga leak, and now the 1997 Space World build being released. And that's the amazing thing with Ocarina of Time. Its long development cycle had many changes and unique differences that even after all this time, we still find new material like this massive horde of maps. And it's not just maps, but story content, items, and so much more still there to explore. So hit the subscribe button, for I'll plan to be back with more Zelda Cut content and other series too. Hit the like button too if you liked it, and comment below on which of these maps were your favorite. So everyone, thank you for watching.